Hello all! Today I'll be working on a red plaid hypoallergenic acrylic scarf made from thrifted and secondhand yarn and talking a bit about how and why I got my semicolon tattoo. Content warning for past self-unalive ideation, both passive and active due to internalized ableism, but I'm here now and it does get better. I hope you enjoy. My name is Took. I'm a disabled genderqueer weaver who's had life take odd turns, but who knows that even tattered and worn yarn still has value, and that tired joints and health flares don't have to stop the journey. I weave exclusively with secondhand fibers, aided with adaptive warping, HR and OSHA cats, and a wonderful found family. Welcome to Hawksong Weaving, where all our paths are a little bit warped. I won't get into the heavy stuff right away, instead I'll focus on how and why I'm making this scarf, but I will give a heads up before the heavy stuff hits so that you can skip it if you want to. There is no shame in skipping it if you need to do that. This topic is not for everyone, and a lot of people are rightfully triggered by it. First things first, I think acrylic yarn gets a bad rap amongst weavers. We've all encountered it at thrift stores. It's the older, probably musty smelling yarn that seems to crop up everywhere. I mean, it warps beautifully. It's acrylic, so it's the same tension throughout. It's not too fuzzy, so it won't catch on itself, but at the same time, it's fuzzy enough to provide a really good grip for a just learning weaver. I genuinely recommend these acrylic yarn skeins to beginning weavers. They're solid, as evidenced by the fact that they're in the thrift store, they'll last forever, and they're cheap. So often, beginning weavers are terrified of mucking something up, and this yarn reduces a lot of that fear. The cheaper acrylic yarns are also really great for learning the adaptive warping method I use. A bit of an explanation on why I've developed this adaptive warping method. I have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which has cascaded into postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So for time's sake, know that I have joints that don't work, and if I shift positions too quickly, I get pre-syncope or pre-fainting symptoms. All of this comes with chronic pain, so for a lot of reasons, a traditional warping board doesn't work for me, along with being really expensive and taking up a lot of space in my small studio. So I use an accordion coat rack as my warping board. It's nice and neat, it contracts into a nice smaller space, and I can adjust it as I need to. And I don't need to be up and down and all around and having tachycardia, a racing heart, that stresses out my medical alert cat Penelope Calico. Because people have asked, no, she's not actually trained in any way, she's not licensed in any way, she is just a calico who has tortitude about my heart rate and is happy to scream her opinions of my heart rate at me until I sit down. She's also recently taught my other actual ESA cat how to bite my ankles if I'm not listening to her. And being bitten by a Maine Coon Bengal mix is not fun, especially when he looks so sad about doing so. So I've now just started listening to her when she starts screaming at me. A bit of a time skip, and with the warp threads sorted, I'm lifting up the loom to release the warping board from the loom, gathering the warp threads into one large bundle and using the back of my neck to drape them over and keep them tidy and out of the way, while I collapse the warping board and get it tucked out of the way. I use terry cloth towels to cushion the warp threads. This helps prevent the finished weaving from being tighter at the ends and looser in the middle, creating a sort of sausage profile in the weaving. A lot of other weavers use cardstock. I find that too slippy and it just goes everywhere and it doesn't really work for me. Terry cloth towels are cheap, easy to find at local thrift stores, and they've got a lot more grip, and while they do need to be washed periodically to refluff them, they're not going anywhere. The way I warp has me cutting the warp loops at the end of winding the warp. Again, this is what's easiest on my body for my methodology. It won't work for everyone, and that's okay. This isn't a great angle, but I'm being careful to pay attention to how the warp threads are laying on the back bar of the loom, and the right hand thread goes through the smaller hole in the rigid heddle reed. It's not critical, and some minor mistakes aren't the end of the world, but it does make it easier to keep the tension of the warp threads even across the entire weaving. I'd like to thank you for watching. If you'd like to support my work, some free ways to do that are to like, subscribe, or follow, and share. This applies to other small artists as well. It's a great way to let the social media algorithms know that this is content worth watching. If you'd like to support me financially, there's a Buy Me a Coffee linked below, which acts as sort of a tip jar. Also, now that there are so many of you absolutely fantastic and wonderful subscribers, I've been able to link the online Hawksong Weaving shop, so feel free to check out the unique hand-woven products. This next bit is absolutely a joke, but just in case in this economy I won't say no. For $1,000 a month, you can tell me that I'm not actually disabled, I'm just lazy, and to try whatever yoga, juice cleanse, snake oil nonsense fixed your cousin. Feel free to message me and I'll get you my payment deets. I take Cash App, Venmo, and PayPal for this nonsense, or you can tell me that, oh, I can't be autistic, I don't act like your 4-year-old nephew. Yeah. Also, there's no such thing as mild autism, we're not salsa. But unrelated, but also sort of related, there's a new exciting thing in the works. Some friends and I have started a new nonprofit, Mill River Marginalized Artists Collective. The Mill River Marginalized Artists Collective, or MRMAC, provides support, resources, and opportunities for marginalized artists by marginalized artists and our supporters. Separate we are small, together we are mighty. Think of that scene in A Bug's Life where all the ants come together and beat up the grasshoppers. Only our goal is not to beat up grasshoppers, our goal is to get a retail space in which to sell discounted reclaimed art supplies and art by marginalized artists of Western Massachusetts, and to offer grants to local marginalized artists for the purposes of purchasing art machines, looms, printing presses, printers, etc., digital advertising, art market vendor fees, transportation, and rental spaces, and rental fees for the Mermac retail space. The long-term goal is to offer a full lending library of art machines and other supplies, classes for artists by artists, and attend art markets on each other's behalf. Essentially, we're unionizing and forming a guild. I'll attach all of the links below. One of the best ways to help is to follow and share everything we post in order to get our content past the algorithm suppression. Because our existence has been deemed political, unquotes, and apps like Insta aren't going to share our work as easily. Another bit of a time skip, and attaching the warp to the bottom apron bar is pretty easy. I finger comb it, get it separated into bits about 4 to 5 warp threads wide, separate these bits into 2, and then do a half hitch tie to the apron bar. I'm more careful to do tighter groupings, for lack of a better term, with this acrylic than I am with various wools for various wool scarves, because the acrylic's not going to cling to itself as easily and I'm not going to be able to steam block it. Something to note if you have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or hypomobility in general, if your fingertips are hypermobile, please be sure to brace them properly, otherwise you will overextend them. You can see that I'm being careful to brace my thumbs before I start the tightening. It's so easy to overextend, and that just builds up and causes arthritis. Next, tucking in the next terry cloth towel for the bottom bar. This again helps prevent things from sausaging, helps create the proper tension, and I'm going to tighten things again. I prefer to weave at a very high tension. It's just a personal preference. Everyone's going to weave by feel and discover how they prefer to weave things. Again, it comes down to personal preference for a lot of it, but also I find weaving at low tension, it goes everywhere. It's hard to get a solid weave. And for something like acrylic where it can handle that high tension, lovely, adore it. Wonderful sensory for me. Now starting the actual weaving, I've got some scraps left over from the balls of the warp, so I'm going to utilize as much of this as I can for this piece, or as much as it looks good. And I'm going to do a sort of crisscross across my shuttle. This helps get more yarn onto it and not have it bulk up in the middle. You'll see that I'm sort of going crisscross applesauce all the way across and getting a nice border on. And here we go. Content warning time. I'm going to be talking about some heavy topics. I'll put the time mark above this, where I stop this topic above. Please take care of yourself and don't engage with this topic if you're not in a headspace to. Also, if I see any comments mocking people for needing a content warning, I will block you. You are not going to be entitled to my content if you're going to act like that. So, where to start? I guess beginning at the beginning. I'm late recognized autistic. Like most assigned female at birth children in the 90s, I was slapped with a generalized anxiety and panic disorder. Unlike most of them, I was medicated for that diagnosis from age 7. That misdiagnosis and overmedication for the wrong diagnosis then led to health complications decades later, which is part of why I had to get a double mastectomy early on this year. But even at that age, I knew there was something quote-unquote wrong with me, and I had what I'm now able to recognize as passive self-yeet ideation starting at age 8. It wasn't anything truly distressing for me at the time, just a continued annoyance that I kept waking up from sleeping. I genuinely believed for most of my life that I couldn't do anything about not wanting to be here because it would make people sad, but if something happens to happen to me, I wouldn't be sad about it. Because of the misdiagnosis, I wasn't able to figure out what was quote-unquote wrong with me for decades, and this passive ideation remained fairly consistent. Spoiler alert, there wasn't anything wrong with me. I was incredibly normal for an autistic child. But when you've gone your whole life being told you're a donkey when you're pretty sure you're an onager, it's going to mess with your head. A side note for those who don't know, an onager is a type of wild donkey. They look very similar, but their behavior is even more jerkish because they're wild. But like, same appearance, very similar appearance, not the same thing at all when it comes to behavior. So I find it a very apt metaphor for invisible disabilities like autism. A few years ago, this background radiation of self-yeet ideation got much stronger as my health finally hit its threshold. I mentioned earlier that I have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. I also have mast cell activation syndrome, which is where your body decides to be allergic to a lot of things randomly with no seeming connection, and it's basically an overproduction of histamines, but it can really screw with you. All three of them are some of the hardest things to get a diagnosis for when you're fat and woman-shaped, but also cause some of the worst brain fog and chronic fatigue you can imagine, not to mention the pain and lack of mobility. For all my parentified eldest daughters out there, and I use that term gender neutrally, you can see where this is going. I had spent my entire life only valuing myself for how I could serve and be useful to others. And my only safety from my not understanding how other humans humaned due to my autism was my intellect and articulation. And now I was failing left and right, and I was genuinely terrified that I was either going to be abandoned by my partners and found family or left behind, or they'd realize that I was more broken than they signed up for. I was genuinely terrified that I was losing my mind, that I'd end up in a group home, that I wasn't ever going to get my mind back. I lost the ability to work either of my careers as a librarian or as a direct support professional, and my depression fully fed on my internalized ableism. That winter just gets referred to as the bad winter for me because I was terrified of either staying and being a drain on my partners, but I was equally terrified of how aware I was of the medicine cabinet. It would be so easy to just take everything and not be a burden anymore. And because my found family was familiar with depression, I knew they would understand. They'd be sad and heartbroken, but they'd understand. Hades Himbo kept me here. He wouldn't have understood. He would have been scared. He would have been lost. And I couldn't do that to him. So I stayed. I stayed and things got better. I learned how to manage my symptoms for the EDS, POTS, and MCAS. I learned through trial and error how to manage doctors and advocate for myself in a medical system designed to unalive me. Through trial and error, I worked out my adaptive weaving methods when my hands could no longer knit. I and my loved ones rebuilt my life brick by brick. I started doing art markets and throwing myself into content creation. I wove and I wove and I wove, and each reclamation of fiber that would have been thrown away healed something inside me again and again and again. Weaving with abandoned things and turning them into useful, beautiful things and wanted objects helped me regain control over my life and shifted my values to things inside my control, shifted my value of myself to things within my control. And I made friends and community, real friends and real community for the first time since I was a small child. It wasn't just me and my partners against the world, it was a wide network of friends and found family who support each other. And one of my best friends gave me my first tattoo after a summer spent gathering bounty and an autumn dealing with political blows and rising to the challenge of creating a nonprofit to help other artists like us. In the context of self-yeeting, a semicolon represents a place where the sentence or the life could have stopped but didn't. It's a symbol of mourning those who have gone on, celebrating them and their loss, and a symbol of hope for those struggling. Mine is on my middle finger because if I go, I will not go quietly. I will go screaming and fighting for those that this world has deemed disposable. I will not suffer in silence because I almost ended there. And my content has shown me how much representation for people like me is needed. You're not alone, we're not alone, and that's sad and terrifying but also so wonderful. We're not by ourselves in this, and it does get better. And on that note, let's tie off these scarf fringes. I prefer to do 2x2 warps tied into a fringe of 4, but we'll do a double sliding knot of 3 if I don't have a wide enough warp. Now unrolling, seeing the finished product, or the almost finished product for the first time, noting some spots where I need to stretch the weaving out to get the acrylic to lay properly, but otherwise, beautiful scarf, all finished, and I'm going to tie off the ends, but other than that, we're pretty much golden. For my acrylic hypoallergenic scarves, I don't steam block because acrylic it would melt, but I do get out my don't ask me how much I've spent on these good shears and trim it. The final step is between half an hour and 45 minutes of tying the fringe knots. This isn't absolutely necessary, especially with acrylic, it's not going to unravel right away, but it is a nice feature that I prefer to do because it makes a more finished, polished looking product. Thank you for coming along as I wove this red plaid scarf and talked about some heavy topics. I'm so glad for the odd turn that your path took that brought you here. Thank you for spending time with me at Hawksong Weaving, where we're all a bit warped, and I hope that you have a truly excellent week. And if you've stayed like I have, thank you for staying. You're wanted and you're needed.